First of all, thank you very much, Ivo and Katrina, for this very kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. And also thank you, Professor Rodriguez Eras, for this very interesting presentation. And so let's continue on the very topical subject of liability, specifically focusing on a use case, autonomous vehicles. So I want to give you a little bit of background information on the project in which I'm working on. And I'm very happy to see that Professor Dr. David Pisort is here today also attending the workshop, and I thank him. So this project is the Safer Autonomous System project. It aims at fostering trust in the autonomous systems, whether they be autonomous vehicles, could be aircraft. There are a lot of different use cases, also maritime autonomous vessels, etc. And it encompasses a really multidisciplinary approach. So there are 15 early stage researchers. Most of them are engineers or computer scientists working in different scientific fields. And the main goal is really, as I said, to foster trust in autonomous systems. And that goes through designing safe systems, proving that these systems are safe enough, and also providing assurance strategies. And within this project, I come at the end. So really, when something goes wrong, who is liable? And so as we saw, I investigate the liability challenges and I try to look at how we can address them. So just as a quick summary, what we'll be seeing today, I will be giving you a really brief introduction on the autonomous vehicle setting. Then we will delve into the liability challenges from a general point of view, then from the perspective of the manufacturer, the cloud services, and cybersecurity. And finally, we will briefly look at the possible options to address these challenges. So I want to look at the autonomous vehicle setting. I think it's important to look at this setting, but as a disclaimer, it's a very difficult exercise because the exact technological setting and configuration is not yet fully known. You have many different competing technological scenarios and designs and operational models that are currently being developed out there. And you also have different automation levels for these different autonomous vehicles. So it makes it a very challenging exercise. But I will try to give you a glimpse at what some of these artifacts may look like and some of these ecosystems may look at. So it goes without saying, it seems obvious, but these new vehicles are extremely complex artifacts, technological artifacts. They embed both hardware components that would be used through sensors, communication interfaces, computing platforms, actor interfaces. They also embed software, obviously, for localization, perception, decision-making, object detection, etc. And on top of that, in the connected and cooperative paradigm of autonomous vehicles, you have also cloud computing services that add to these different components. And if you want to look at the three main characteristics of autonomous vehicles, they are highly data reliant, as Professor Rodriguez said. They are connected and cooperative, and they are AI driven, or more specifically, machine learning techniques are employed within these autonomous vehicles. But it wouldn't make sense to only look at the technological artifact itself. You also have to look at the larger ecosystem in which these vehicles will be navigating, will be roaming the roads. And you can see from this picture, it's just an illustration among others. It doesn't mean this is going to be the model that will be adopted, but you can see that it's extremely complex. You have a lot of different actors, a lot of different components interacting with each other. And well, then the question is, when there is a failure, who is liable? So you can see in this picture, you have two cars. They may be communicating through V2V communications. There may be vehicle-to-infrastructure communications. There may be also communication between the vehicle and a potential remote operator. You will have communication with network providers. You possibly communication with traffic centers. You may have an infrastructure manager. The manufacturer may also house potentially in certain models that is not necessarily yet fully determined, but could also house some of the backend servers. So you see, it's a very, very complex picture. But what happens when a failure of one or several of these components or services causes an accident? Who is liable? How does the victim claim compensation? Against whom? So let's first look at some of the general issues and general attributes that may arise. As we've seen, these vehicles are extremely complex artifacts, and they're complex for different reasons. There are different features that make them extremely complex. You have a lot of different stakeholders involved in the design and operation of these vehicles. You have a multiplicity of cyber-physical components which interact with each other in a very complex way. And this means that there are a lot of technological and operational interdependencies. The second element is the opaqueness and lack of clarity. You see that at this moment, it's not here, and will it ever be clear? That's the question. And I think we need to do a mapping of the entire ecosystem to better delineate the potential responsibilities. Will it ever be clear? These interrelationships between these different parties, different stakeholders, is not yet clear. And this will make claims much more difficult, presumably, and this increases the lack of legal certainty. And the third element, as been mentioned previously, is that in Europe, liability is extremely fragmented. Mostly is national specific. You have different liability regimes. When it comes to road traffic liability, for example, you have fault-based road traffic liability in certain jurisdictions, certain countries. You also have strict-based liability in other jurisdictions, or no-fault compensation schemes, etc., etc. So a very complex picture. Now, let's look at one of the prime actors that most people think of when an accident involving an autonomous vehicle or even a vehicle occurs. There's been a lot of scholarship and literature on this specific topic. But let's first look at what we see with some of other authors that Charles Ducoin and Professor Valk, we wrote in an article, is that we kind of see that the manufacturer may be sliding towards new responsibilities. And what I mean by that is that the manufacturer may be more and more involved in operational functions or activities and services, where before the manufacturer was only involved in designing and then producing and marketing a product. The manufacturer with these new autonomous vehicles may also be involved in runtime operation. That's as a disclaimer again, in certain technological configurations. Why is that? Well, because the manufacturer may have to provide continuous safety or security software updates to provide against cybersecurity vulnerabilities or threats. Secondly, the manufacturer of these autonomous vehicles may have to provide dynamic safety and cybersecurity monitoring on a runtime basis. And thirdly, in certain technological scenarios, the manufacturer may also be housing some of the backend servers. And so you see that the product versus service dichotomy is a bit blurred with these new vehicles, these new technologies, and also the new operational paradigms. But how would liability play out when something goes wrong with one of these autonomous vehicles? Well, I would say that it has been touched upon very greatly by a professor before, but one of the assumptions that's been discussed heavily in scholarship is that you would have a control shift induced by the autonomous features from the vehicle operator towards the machine, and this would result in a liability shift towards the manufacturer. But is it that simple? We'll see that it's maybe not that straightforward. So you know that the Product Liability Directive has been mentioned, is a European piece of legislation, a directive that has been transposed into national law in member states. It provides for a strict liability regime that targets the producer. The producer is liable for defective products. However, when applied to these new technologies, to autonomous vehicles, there may be implementation difficulties for the victim. As been mentioned, first, can we qualify software as a product, since software will have a very big role in these vehicles and could have a causal role in the accident's occurrence. The second element is the uncertain characterization of the defectiveness. You know that within the Product Liability Directive, if a product is deemed defective if it fails to meet the reasonable safety expectations. And with these new vehicles, for which we don't have much experience yet, what could be these reasonable safety expectations is not yet clear. However, even if the victim managed to implement the Product Liability Directive, then the producer may shield itself from liability by invoking several defenses, such as the state-of-the-art defense or the later defect defense. I want to go a little bit more into the practicalities. So we saw that the victim will have implementing difficulties when it tries to implement the product liability. It could also try to implement fault or negligence liability, but that will be a very uneasy path for the victim. Why? Well, because has been demonstrated before, it will be extremely burdensome for the victim to prove a wrongful act or breach of duty of care, the damage, and specifically the causal link between the damage and the act giving rise to liability. Given this very complex ecosystem, it will be extremely difficult. But in many cases, in a lot of different jurisdictions across Europe, it is highly likely that these victims will target other actors under strict liability or no-fault road traffic compensation schemes, if available. That would be, for example, the vehicle users, the vehicle liability insurance companies, in case of no-fault compensation scheme, for example. The victim will bring a claim directly against the vehicle liability insurance company, and then this insurance company may want to address recourse actions against, could be the manufacturer, could be data providers, service providers, etc., etc. Now let's look at another complex technological setting, which is more embedded into the operational setting of autonomous vehicles. Cloud technologies, which may have a role in these vehicles' operation. So we know that cloud cloud technologies is a really booming word. It's a very buzzword and an important one. It's not new. It's been there for quite some years now, but it has many applications from home, mobility, manufacturing, and it's extremely prevalent nowadays. But what is a cloud? Simply, it's usually defined as a pool of virtualized computer resources, a network of computer resources available for different purposes. You have different kind of services, different kind of cloud, I would say, application that are possible. You have software as a cloud, platform as a software, as a service, infrastructure as a service, etc., etc. So these cloud computing paradigms provide really scalable access to computing resources and IT services, and they also imply a shift in paradigm. We may be moving from investing in infrastructure to renting infrastructure. But what are clouds doing in autonomous vehicles? How would they apply? How would these technologies and other associated technologies apply in autonomous vehicles? Well, specifically in connected and cooperative vehicles, they would rely on features such as exchange of information between road traffic conditions with other vehicles, so-called V2V communications, as well as other infrastructure, V2 infrastructure communications. Cloud services and associated technologies could be used to increase the vehicle's computing and storage capacities and also allow for resource sharing for better and more efficient operations. It could also allow other services such as fleet platooning, cooperative driving, etc., etc. So you see that you have also different cloud technologies. You have core cloud technologies that are rely more on a centralized approach. You also have new technologies that are being developed currently, which is edge, fog, and vehicular computing for data storage, processing, computing, resource sharing, etc. But there are a lot of technical limitations and technical challenges, such as latency issues, possible disruptions, cybersecurity prone, for sure, as these are highly connected to the internet, etc., etc. Now, let's look at the liability implications. Well, you have a lot of different actors which are involved in this cloud, I would say, ecosystem. And this kind of widens the chains of responsibility and makes it very complex to try to identify a responsible actor when something goes wrong. Moreover, you have different damage scenarios. The damage could result from a breach of personal data, which was possible in the case of vehicles, could result in a loss of corrupt data, or which interests us here, injury or death related due to a safety or security failure. Well, when it comes to liability for these damages, the third-party victim will likely bring a claim against either the manufacturer or the mobility provider, operator, user, or vehicle liability insurer. Then these parties could reallocate the liability costs through contractual provisions or recourse actions. So these liability costs could be between the liability costs between the cloud service providers and customer may be distributed through contractual provisions, and the customer could be either the manufacturer or could be the mobility provider. However, clauses in contract can limit the vendor's liability, and you have various situations depending on the jurisdictions. And you know that contract law is also highly national specific. And in certain countries, it's not possible to exclude liability for death or injury. I think my time is running. I will go quicker. The other main issue, which is a transversal issue that concerns both the manufacturer and also the cloud service providers and other actors within the autonomous vehicle value chain, is cybersecurity. And you know that with connectivity, increased digitalization. This means that the attack surface is really much more important with these new vehicles. And cybersecurity is a new concern for car manufacturers, revenue concern for car manufacturers, and not so much for other actors such as, in other sectors such as aviation, which has already been so for quite some while. But this distributed nature of cyber risks means that it doesn't only concern the manufacturer, but the entire autonomous vehicle value chain. And then when it comes to, well, attributing liability when there's a cyber attack that targets an autonomous vehicle, not very clear who could be held and on which basis could be held liable for that cybersecurity failure. Of course, it will be extremely difficult to identify the criminal offender, so the victim may want to bring a claim against the manufacturer, since the manufacturer will be increasingly involved in product monitoring, software security, and safety updates. But will the manufacturer see increased liability exposure? That's one of the main questions. Can cybersecurity vulnerability be seen as a defect in the product? We would have to look at the safety and security expectations. And in the UK, the manufacturer may also be held liable for a duty of care, and it could be applied to provide adequate protection to autonomous systems. That's one of the questions. But is it reasonable to expect the manufacturer to predict every risk in advance, given this very dynamic ecosystem? Possibly not. Other parties within this ecosystem could also be held liable, such as service providers, for example. So it's a very uncertain picture at this moment. So let's look at the way forward. So what can be done to address some of these liability gaps? And what is sure is that one prerequisite is that we need to provide legal certainty to all stakeholders and victims. So we need a European approach, and completely agree, Professor Rodriguez-Eras. We need also a clear point of entry, a facilitated claim process for the victim. In order to foster trust in these vehicles and enable their uptake, the victim needs to be assured that if it suffers damage as a result of this autonomous vehicle, it may be compensated. We also may need a clear and more uniform rights of recourse for the fair allocation of liability costs between all the involved stakeholders within the autonomous vehicle ecosystems. So I won't go back on the different options that has been explained. There is legal liability for AI systems. That's a very contentious point. We could adapt the product liability directive. We could also create an ad hoc no-fault compensation or strict liability scheme, or also some have talked about putting in place an insurance fund. So you have different options that are available. And you have two current initiatives that has been mentioned. You have the European Parliament Committee proposal, which proposes a horizontal strict liability regime for operators of high-risk AI systems. They're a very interesting approach. I see certain shortcomings in this proposal in the sense that it is horizontal. It's a one-size-fits-all regime. And maybe it doesn't take into account the specific risk of each sector, and that may be problematic. Moreover, it imposes, from my understanding, certain liability caps as well, which may be insufficient in certain sectors where the risk profile is much more important, such as, for example, aviation. Could be other sectors as well. And you also have an interesting study that was commissioned by the European Commission and written by Andrea Bertolini, which proposes a differentiated sector or technology-specific risk management approach. And he thinks that it's not completely necessary to overhaul the product liability directive, but he proposes I would say, an ad hoc legislation at the European level that would set uniform rules. And this legislation would be based on a risk management approach where the party which would be burdened by liability would be the party that is best positioned to ensure and minimize risk and ensure compliance with safety relevant duties. So depending on the sector, this best positioned party, which would be burdened with liability, may vary. And so I think it's a very interesting and granular approach that could be interesting also to consider within current discussions at the European level. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.